Hello and welcome to Heart Like Vedic Astrology. Today I was going to talk about the astrological transits that are going on in the upcoming month, June 2022. But this is a Vedic astrology point of view, not a Western point of view, Western astrology point of view, so keep that in mind. And as part of the transits that are going on this coming month, and actually some that we're right in the middle of, I was going to talk about what is going on with children in the United States, and I've included a certain amount of analysis for the birth chart of the United States in the talk today. A note first, the information presented here is for educational purposes only. It should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. And transits, I know they're popular to go through like transit information and transit videos and stuff. Those are called gochar in Sanskrit. Actually, in Vedic astrology, we usually consider them last when evaluating a horoscope in Vedic astrology or Jyotish. Mostly we start with the lagna or the ascendant rising sign, yogas or planetary combinations, amsha or sub-zodiac analysis, and Bhav or house analysis or vichara. These levels of analysis are done first, and then transits are looked at, because transits, they can signal times when events are triggered, but this depends on many individual factors, such as when what dasha or planetary period someone is currently in, and if something is not actually indicated in the birth chart or kundali, a transit may not be meaningful for a certain individual. So keep that in mind. If you want to see an example of me going through these various levels of analysis to understand the process of a Vedic astrologer, you can see my video Anatomy and Eclipse for April 2022. And also, I mentioned briefly, but Vedic astrology or sidereal astrology is different from Western astrology or tropical astrology. There are significant differences, so dates, signs, interpretation, etc. may not coincide. So, i.e., just because you are a Scorpio in Western astrology does not necessarily mean you are a Scorpio in the Vedic system as well. So also keep that in mind. And a special trigger warning for today, I'm actually going to be discussing recent events, national events, and so these events include injury to life and loss of life, and it is kind of a hot topic, and I'm not putting this video together to, stir the pot even more. I know people are dealing with a lot of the emotional fallout of certain events, but I was curious myself, and I thought some other people might be interested in the astrology behind some of these events. So if you've had too much, or you're having a bad day, or if the information seems a little bit heavy, then stop watching this and go find another more pleasant, lighthearted video to watch. All right. So transit dates in June of 2022. I've just listed them here so you have a concise list, and then I'm going to go through these to indicate what sort of energies are going to be, manifesting in the next month or so. And again, I'm doing this at the last few days of May, and there's actually a lot going on right now. So I'm going to be including that information. So May 27th through 30th, there's a planetary war going on between Jupiter and Mars. Planetary war is called Graha Yuddha in Sanskrit. And then May 30th, or tomorrow, there's going to be a new moon in Rohini Nakshatra. And nakshatras are they're called lunar mansions. Then on June 3rd, Saturn is going retrograde while Mercury goes direct. June 14th, there's going to be a full moon in Jyesta Nakshatra. And also Saturn enters Sandhi. And then on June 15th, the Sun enters Gemini or Mithuna. On June 17th, Venus enters Taurus or Vrishabha. June 26th, Mars enters Aries or Misha. And June 28th, we have another new moon in Ardra Nakshatra. So those are the transits and conditions that are changing in the next few weeks. And also, just so you know, whenever doing transit analysis, Vedic astrology usually emphasizes the slow-moving planets, which are Jupiter, Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu, the nodes of the moon. So, this planetary war, May 27th through 30th, between Jupiter and Mars. Jupiter is considered the winner of this war, but whenever two planets are in war, they're both destabilized, even if one ends up being the winner. And just as a reminder, Jupiter is a planet that symbolizes things like law, justice, philosophy, children, teachers, oration, balance, harmony, and spirituality. And Mars, on the other hand, symbolizes things like fighting, or fighter, and a warrior, a rebel, passion, siblings, enemies, accidents, and injury, and even surgery, actually. So when you get these two planets together, and what planetary war means is that these two true planets are within 1 degree of each other, so they're sitting right on top of each other. So when you have this sort of combination, it tends to symbolize things like lawyers, because Jupiter's oration and Mars is fighting, so people who fight with words are lawyers. Siblings, children, your siblings' children, spiritual warriors, yogis, because they have that fiery aspect of Mars, but they're doing it within a spiritual context. Crusaders, because again, these are like fighting people who are fighting for philosophy and ideas. Rebel with a cause, freedom fighters, and very zealous people, because again, Jupiter and Mars together is a lot of excitement, enthusiasm, passion. Yeah. So these two planets are in war in the sign of Pisces. Again, this is according to the Vedic system. And Pisces is a sign it's a water sign, so it's about emotions, but deep emotions. And it also symbolizes things like large watery places like oceans and beaches. It also symbolizes, because it's the last sign of the natural zodiac, it's the 12th sign. And the 12th sign is an indication of things that are lost or let go of. That Pisces can indicate places of isolation, such as temples and monasteries, hospitals and prisons. So since Mars entered Pisces, what's been interesting, so once Mars entered the same sign that Jupiter's been in for a little bit, and Jupiter just moved into that sign in last month, so it's pretty fresh energy, is that we've been seeing things in the United States such as fights about abortion rights. There's also like a national lack of infant formula, so feeding children is an issue. And then, unfortunately, on May 24th, or just a few days ago, there was a large school shooting in the United States. So, again, it crossed my mind. I'm like, what's going on with children? And what's the astrology behind it? So that's kind of the motivation that came for doing this talk, or adding it to this transit talk. So let's do that. So here is a chart, a horoscope chart. If you haven't seen one before, this is a Northern Indian style chart. And to orient you, the top middle diamond there with the 8 in the bottom corner, that square or diamond at the top represents the eastern part of the sky. And so when the sun rises in the east, that's going to be your rising sign, also known as the ascendant, also known as the lagna in Vedic astrology. So the rising sign for this particular chart is the 8th sign, which is Scorpio. So this is a Scorpio rising, Scorpio ascendant, Scorpio lagna, whichever word you'd like to use, okay? So this chart is ruled by Mars. And this chart represents the sky pattern for June 1st, 2022 at 2300 UTC, Universal time. Yeah. So what do we see here? Well, Mars rules Scorpio, and because Scorpio is the rising sign of this chart, Mars is the ruling sign of this chart. Mars has gone to the 5th house, which represents things like children and creativity, counseling and intellect. And this is where the Graha Yuddha, or the planetary war, is going on with Jupiter. So you can see circled here, Jupiter and Mars together. And the fifth house also, besides representing things like children, creativity, counseling, and intellect, it also is considered a dharmasthana, and a dharmasthana is a house of duty. Okay, so the motivations of any planets in the fifth house are going to be related to duty. So it might, since I mentioned Jupiter represents children, and Jupiter happens to be in its own sign of Pisces, it rules Pisces, you might think, wow, that's great, Jupiter's strong, it's in its own house, and it's in the fifth house of children, representing children. That sounds really good. But there's this principle in Vedic astrology called Karkobhavanasha. And then what that means is that the planet that represents the living being or happens to be in the house that also represents that same being. So for example, Jupiter, which as a planet represents children, and the fifth house represents children. So Jupiter in the fifth house actually indicates trouble with that person, in this case being children. And it may be the relationship with that individual or person represented by the planet is, or it could just be problems with the person themselves. So, for example, Mars represents siblings, and the third house represents siblings. So Mars in the third house would be a similar thing, a similar type energy. Moon represents mother. The fourth house represents mother. So when you see Moon in the fourth house, you can get a Karkobhavanasha with the Moon. The seventh house is partnerships, a spouse, and Venus represents spouse. So when you have Venus in the seventh house, it can indicate trouble with the spouse. And the sun represents father, and the ninth house represents father. So when you have sun in the ninth house, that's another type of Karkobhavanasha. So again, it looks pretty good, but if you're not familiar with this principle, you might miss that there's it almost sort of indicates too much energy around the subject. Okay, so that's an important note. And then you see all these arrows here. So let's focus on the orange arrows first. So the orange arrows going out from the circle around Jupiter and Mars. These orange lines, arrows, indicate the houses that Jupiter aspects or shines its light on. So Jupiter shines its light 5 houses away, 7 houses away, and 9 houses away. So, and Jupiter also owns, besides the 5th house of children and creativity, it also in this chart owns the 2nd house of speech and oration. So when you have, again, Jupiter and Mars together, you can get fiery speech, especially when it's located in this aspect of the chart. And because Jupiter's aspecting the 9th house, which represents religion and community, and it aspects the 11th house, which represents groups, and it aspects the 1st house, which represents identity, what's going on with this planetary war is going to affect those aspects. Okay, so religion, community, groups, identity. Now Mars, so now if we move to the red arrows here, Mars has special aspects as well. It aspects 4 houses away, 7 houses away, and 8 houses away. So in this chart, Mars is going to aspect the 8th house of, unfortunately, death and chronic illness, chronic issues. It's going to reflect into the 11th house of groups, and it's going to reflect into the 12th house of endings and loss. Mars in this chart is also ruler of, as I mentioned, the chart, but it's also ruler of the 6th house, which is indicative of enemies and accidents. So you have the 6th house-ness of enemies and accidents, that energy sort of underlying, being drawn into this planetary war, and it's being extrapolated out, reflected out into these other areas. Okay. So Jupiter and Mars are affecting a lot of things. with this planetary war. So you might be asking, why is this chart oriented to Scorpio rising sign? So the reason the reason why is that I started to notice some patterns here. And when I look at the sky pattern for May 24th, and this is the day when the shooting in Texas, in a Texas school happened just a few days ago. And so the chart on the left is that day, May 24th, just a few days ago. It's at about 11:30 in the evening or so. So the events actually happened a little bit earlier in the day, but I just oriented it again so that the rising sign is Scorpio, so that we can compare charts. Okay, but you can see the sky pattern was similar. The moon was also involved with that planetary war with Mars and Jupiter. And then you can start to see that, let's go through the arrows here. So Mars is aspecting into the 8 houses away into the 12th house of endings and losses. All right, so that is going to be part of this energy here. The other thing is that this planetary war is being sandwiched, okay, between Saturn in the sign before it in Aquarius, and with Rahu, which is going to be in the sign ahead of it. Saturn and Rahu and Mars are all considered malefic planets. They can bring some negative energies, some tough energies to digest. And so when you have this sort of situation, and I drew this little blue curve line here, so Saturn, Mars, Rahu, that's actually a kind of yoga. It's considered a mala, or sort of a necklace of negativity, okay? And so that's going to bring, again, it's going to make the situation that's already unstable, this planetary war, it's going to actually exacerbate things, unfortunately. Okay, and as I mentioned, Mars aspects into the 12th house, so 8 houses away, the house that represents endings and loss. And over in that 12th house, up in the upper right corner, is K2. K2 is the south node of the moon. K2 is a very unstable planet. It's known for things like hidden things, mental health issues. It's related to diseases that are hard to detect or cure. It can also indicate, sudden, violent eruptions, and it can indicate separation. So all of this, the planetary war between Mars and Jupiter, like, that's already significant. And then you have it sandwiched between Saturn and Rahu with this, yoga mala of malefic energy, and it's aspecting into the house with K2. Like, that's like a powder keg, with a fuse that's just about to ignite. And that's essentially what happened on this day. What was I going to go through? Oh, so so I have on here also, there's like this blue arrow coming down from the 3rd house. There's a little 10 in the corner, that's Capricorn. So Saturn, you can see it isn't in a full degree yet, it's at 59 minutes. And so Saturn just moved into Aquarius. It's in an unstable position. It's in Sunday. Sunday means a joint, so whenever a planet is in the first or last degree of a sign, it's going to be inherently unstable because it's switching its energies because of the house energies, the sign energies. And so Saturn just moved into Aquarius, but it's actually going to go retrograde in a couple of weeks and start heading back into Capricorn. So Saturn is going to be doing this dance, going to go back and forth, and it's going to come back into Aquarius in January of 2023. Either way, Saturn is forming this necklace around the planetary war, or when Saturn heads back into Capricorn, backtracks back into Capricorn, it's going to be aspecting, reflecting its energy directly onto this Mars, Jupiter, Pisces house. So either way, Saturn is not making it easy for things to go smoothly here. It's a planet that signifies delays and restructuring, that sort of thing. So if you look at the players in this corner, this tight corner, Mars represents siblings and fighting. Moon represents mother and nurturing in the public. Jupiter represents law and children. Saturn represents infrastructure and authority. Rahu indicates foreignness, but also maternal grandparents. So what's interesting to me is when I look at this chart and just knowing the story of, unfortunately, this young man, 18 years old, who ended up shooting in the school. Actually, all the players are right here. For his story too, even though all the news is really focusing on the shooting, and understandably so, on him going in and shooting in a school and killing numerous children and a couple of teachers. He back in March, I was reading, that he moved in with his grandparents because he was fighting with his mother. And actually, before he went on the rampage in the school, he actually shot his grandmother in the face. And she's in critical condition in the hospital as of now, as of this recording. And then there was something about he texted or sent a message to some girl in Germany that he just recently met online a few weeks ago. So this is an unstable guy who had apparently some family issues and apparently some problem with authority, his mother and grandmother. And then he didn't have a lot of friends. I mean, if the only person he's really kind of sharing things with is some woman on the other side of the world he's never met in person, just met a few weeks ago. There's a lot of mental instability in this guy, and a lot of, I would imagine, feelings of isolation and distrust. And again, when we see this kind of energy, again, Saturn is isolation, fear, authority. Rahu is sort of exaggeration and hidden things. Again, this chart is really showing the story that this young man went through. And so, why am I bringing this up? Well, I was also wondering, so why is it specifically this going on in the United States, all these issues? Like I mentioned that the Jupiter in Pisces is in a cargo bhava nasha, so there's a lot, almost too much energy in this house. And actually, on the right side here is the birth chart of the United States. There can be some discrepancy about the exact time. This is oriented towards July 4th, 1776, Philadelphia at 5:10 in the afternoon. I'm not sure if this is an exact birth time. I would think I didn't go into full rectification or correction of this chart, but I think that it might be at least a minute fast based on some things. But I didn't do a full rectification, but it would make more sense to me if it was actually at least a minute earlier. But in any case, you can see here that if we accept this as the birth chart of the United States, that this is a Scorpio rising. So we can kind of compare these two charts because they have the same rising sign. So if you look at this birth chart of the United States, and you look in the lower right corner, what do we have here? Again, circled here for you, but we have Mars and Jupiter again. So this energy is similar to the energies that were present in the sky when the birth of the United States occurred. And not only that, but look at this. You have Rahu in the sign just past where these planets are. And Saturn actually is aspecting directly into this 8th house where there's Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Sun. So more or less, you're getting the same type of energy where you have Mars and Jupiter together, and it's like sort of sandwiched or squeezed between Saturn and Rahu. And again, Mars is aspecting 8 houses away and lining up with Ketu here. So again, there's this like powder keg, being squeezed between Saturn authority and Rahu foreignness. And the 8th house represents deep psychology. So this energy of Mars and Jupiter getting squeezed really by Saturn and Rahu, it really reflects in a lot of ways the deep psyche of the United States and Americans, really, in my mind. So you have the 8th house, which represents deep psychology, and there's this fighting spirit, but there's also clearly this deep mistrust of authority and fighting back against authority. I mean, that's essentially why mostly Europeans first came over about this time, 1776. And now again, with more time, they start to, impose the same sort of, mandates and restrictions on the Native Americans who were here before any of the Europeans showed up. But when we think about the United States as a modern country, 250 years ago, these were the sky pattern that is happening now is actually more or less present in the birth chart of the United States. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that in the very beginning of my talk today, I mentioned that a transit may not be that significant unless there's something in the birth chart that indicates that there might be something there. So again, there's a replication, the signs are a little bit different and the placement's a little bit different, but the setup is the same, more or less. And the other thing to know is that right now the United States is going through its Rahu-Saturn dasha, or planetary period. So the Saturn energy and this Rahu energy are going to be particularly strong and a point of focus. So that's why I brought in the birth chart of the United States. So you could see the similarities here. And again, why this particular transit was actually significant for the United States. And so this slide is basically what you can do in Vedic astrology is you can draw up a chart, kind of a fresh chart for somebody or a place or a moment in time, whatever you're analyzing. And you can draw up a new chart at the time that you're analyzing the birth chart. And it's called the Samaya chart. And this is essentially an update. And it's an update of what? Well, Vedic astrology is essentially based on the idea of karma. And so when you look at somebody's birth chart, or again, a time, place, when you look at a birth chart of something or someone, you're essentially looking at the karmic patterns of somebody at the moment that they were born. Now, the thing is, with every choice that's made, every action that's taken, every thought that's had, you're essentially changing your karma. And so if you engage in a lot of negative activity that's harmful to self or others, your karma is going to change in a certain direction. If you engage in activities that are wholesome and uplifting for self and others, your karma is going to change. So what you can do is draw up a Samaya chart when you're looking at or analyzing the birth chart to update the karmic picture. So again, when we look at this, the chart on the left is a Samaya update chart, and the time is the 20th of May, 2022 at 7:55 Universal Time. And the birth chart, again, it's the same as on the last slide here. Now, if you notice, what are the similarities between these two charts? Well, looky here. You actually have Mars and Jupiter again in the 8th house that represents deep psychology in the Samayya chart, just as you have it in the natal chart of the United States. So this this Mars-Jupiter combination is still a knot of karma for the United States. And what's interesting too to me is that in the natal chart, the original birth chart for the United States, Jupiter and Venus, for example, are in a nakshatra called Ardra. Ardra is represented by a teardrop or rain. And so there's a lot of sadness, and you can imagine like the people, the Europeans who came to the United States about this time and settled the United States at that time and created this sort of modern republic or democracy, they really had to give up everything and leave everything behind. They were essentially outcast. A lot of them were trying to find better economic situation, or they felt suppressed or repressed by the government, and they couldn't live the life they wanted. And so they didn't trust that the government was going to change. They didn't trust that the government was going to take care of them. So there's a deep sense of trust, but also sadness at having to give everything up, go to the other side of the world, if you made it, right, if you survived the journey, and try to create a new life for yourself. So all of that's represented in the birth chart of the United States. And also noticeable differences between these two. In the Samayya chart, instead of being a Scorpio rising now, we have the 5th sign, or Leo rising. And Leo is represented by the sun. The sun represents, the king. It's the king in the court. So there is a sort of lifting up of energy in terms of a hierarchy. And that's essentially what has happened for the United States. But the sun in the Samayya chart has gone to the 10th house of career. It's also an arthasthana, so it's a house representing material creation and material gathering. So and then if we look at the natal chart here, again, it's a Scorpio rising, and Mars has gone to the 8th house. And the 8th house is a mokshasthana. Mokshasthanas are houses of freedom. So in the original chart of the United States, the main impetus or motivation at that time was freedom. And now the motivation is more materialistic gain. So, we're known for being, the capitalist, capitalism, right? We're the center of capitalism. Some might say that's changing because of geopolitics, but that's the reputation there. But you still see that there's this deep knot within the psyche here of not trusting authority and fighting over authority, and also fighting over a guiding philosophy to decide what's best for the society here. Okay. I did also mention that the United States is currently going through a Rahu-Saturn dasha planetary period. Rahu again represents things like hidden things, mental health challenges. Saturn represents things like anxiety, isolation, sadness, systemic change. The other thing to note, another concept in Vedic astrology is the concept of sati. Sati is about a 7.5 year period that occurs when Saturn is in the sign before your natal moon, as it's crossing through the sign of your natal moon, and then as it continues through the sign after your natal moon. So Saturn crosses signs every 2.5 years. So 3 signs times 2.5 years, that's about 7.5 years. And if you see here, the moon in the United States birth chart is in Aquarius, and that's where Saturn is right now. So the United States is going through its sati period, And because it's going through its Saturn bhukti or sub period, this is going to be very strong. So what typically happens in sati sati for a person or a place is that there's a great restructuring, deep, great restructuring. And typically relationships are in flux and change quite a bit. Sometimes sati satis can be positive, or they can have a mix of positive and negative events. A lot of people actually sort of negatively anticipate sati sati, but in any case, it's going to be a difficult time and a time of important catalytic change in the United States. And again, Saturn just moved into Aquarius, so we've got another 5-6 years of this. Yeah, so important to know. So, again, this is a pretty volatile experience, and people are still shocked and overwhelmed and trying to process and trying to understand what they can do, if anything, to prevent further harm in the future, because there have been so many school shootings in the United States. So what does Vedic astrology have to offer along these lines? Well, typically Vedic astrology, because it's based on the notions of karma, is going to suggest spiritual practice in the form of prayer, meditation, mantras, fasting, if that's appropriate for your health condition, or donations, that sort of thing, selfless service, giving to others. And there's a couple of other ideas in here. So the idea of ahimsa, or non-violence. This is a pretty deep practice. I mean, Gandhi essentially built his life and his whole sort of revolution in India around this concept. But it's the idea that you want to observe within yourself, through thought, word, and deed, how much violence is actually generated within yourself. And we say thought, word, or deed because you can't really have a violent word or a violent deed unless there's a violent thought first. So if you can watch your mind and watch your actions and words and notice where there might be tension, stress, or violence against self or others, we want to do our best to stay mindful and to uproot those seeds so that they don't develop, that you don't develop these habits of violent speech or violent actions or violent thoughts even. Yeah. I mean, this is a very deep practice. And the other thing about this is that, why do people get violent? Like, why do they start blaming and shaming other people, right? Well, that's also another deep concept. And there's this, again, this deeper notion in yoga. I mean, yoga essentially means yoking, oneness. Yoga means oneness. And so when we start, slicing and dicing the world and putting up walls between ourselves and other people, we're essentially, we do that to some extent because we see the world as, divided, right? There's an us and a them. And if you get to this place within your being, within your own mind, within your own heart, that we're actually all connected, even if there's trouble, and yes, there are times when, you need to protect yourself so that, you don't allow violence towards self, you don't want that in your world necessarily. But especially during the pandemic, I've noticed, like, every few months, especially in the news, there's some other group to blame or shame. African Americans, and then police, and Asians, and people who are Republicans and Democrats, and people who are wearing masks or vaccinated or not vaccinated, especially the last 2 years of the pandemic. Just every couple months there was like some new group that we were supposed to blame and shame, and and again, that goes against this whole idea that actually underneath it all, we're all connected. And so if we are truly all connected, then any violence that you kind of throw out there at somebody through thought or word or deed, again, is actually towards yourself on some level. So again, that's a deep concept, probably for, a whole set of other talks, but at least I wanted to juice it here. So what else can you do along these lines? I mean, again, I mentioned this young man clearly had issues, and again, it all, again, the powder keg blew, and, unfortunately, literally too, and all these people got injured, passed away physically, and then their families and the community at large is really disturbed by it on so many levels. And I mean, what can you do? I mean, I actually spent myself 10 years working with special needs children, both in inpatient hospital settings, psychiatric settings, as well as outpatient. And what always struck me when I worked with kids, I would always usually get a pretty big thick folder with a lot of history about this kid, and they were usually on a lot of meds, and I got terrible stories from whoever talked to me, parents, teachers, supervisors, social workers, about all the trouble this kid was causing. And what struck me, that all the years that I spent working with kids, and my job, especially with outpatient, was I was just going to show up 2-3 hours a week and take the kid out into the community and do some healthy age appropriate activities and bring them home so the families could have a rest and the kid could have a rest. So it was basically respite work for the family, the whole family. And this wasn't deep psychotherapy I was doing here. Sometimes I would just take the kid and we'd go mini golfing, or we would go for a walk and then go get some soup later, or I take them to the library and we do some like art projects or something there. And the kids never really gave me trouble. And they would usually, within, like, one girl I remember, young girl, I think she was 8 or 9, within a couple months of me, again, showing up for 2-3 hours a week, and she was the quietest kid I ever worked with. And we would go play mini golf, and then we'd go get hot chocolate. Again, she wasn't a talker, so we didn't talk much, but I was there and I was present, and I paid attention to her, and I was just looking out for her. And within 2 months, she went from level 2 to level 10 in her class. And then when our time was over after a year, she told me I was her best friend. So I know that's not true for all cases and all kids, but I think there's something to be said about just very simple being present, taking time, talking to somebody, making yourself available, not just to your own kids, but like people around you, your neighbors, kids, older adults. I mean, the United States is known for being a pretty lonely place. So I think the latest studies was that most American adults don't feel like they have even one person they could call if they had a troubling situation. I mean, that fact is disturbing. And just imagine if you're a teenage kid and your parents, I don't know, are having issues and you don't feel like you have people around that you can talk to. It's going to be a lot to handle. And so maybe just simply reaching out, connecting, checking in, adopting your neighbor, to ease some of this deep sadness and isolation, anxiety, depression that I think it runs pretty deep in society right now. That could be your practice. Yeah. So specifically, though, getting back to the planets here, in any of these practices, again, this whole idea of remedies or upaya in Vedic astrology, it's really important that it's heart-based. So you really want to choose something that's true to your heart and true to your nature, that you will follow through with consistently. That's more important than doing something big and grand and it's not about that. It's not going hard and fast and big. It's really about being sincere and being in integrity. And again, trying to build, from a karmic point of view, trying to build new karmic or plant new karmic seeds in your life. So the planets, they're right at the center of this kind of tight knot of energy. Again, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, and Rahu. And there are different days and groups of people that are associated with them. So if any of these resonate with you as part of how you want to direct your spiritual practice, or whom you want to direct your spiritual practice to, take this under consideration. So Jupiter's day is Thursday, and Jupiter represents teachers and children. So if you want to maybe spend some time donating your time on a Thursday to help teachers and children, something like that might work. Mars day is Tuesday, and so Mars represents a fiery type of career people, so police officers, firefighters, soldiers, veterans, that group. Saturday is Saturn day, and so Saturn represents groups of people who are poor or elderly. So if that group resonates with you, Saturday might be a good day to do your spiritual practice, or again, directed towards this group of people. Rahu is also honored on Saturday, and Rahu indicates people who are foreigners or outcasts or mentally ill. So if those sorts of groups resonate with you and you'd like to direct the spiritual energy or dedicate the fruits of your spiritual practice to them, you can incorporate this layer to, again, the spiritual practice that resonates deep within your heart. Okay. So, more transits. We haven't even really gotten to June yet, and that was what this talk was supposed to be about. So the moon, tomorrow, May 30th, there's a new moon in Rohini, Taurus. Rohini is a nakshatra or lunar mansion, the symbol of which is a cart, and it's in Taurus. So Taurus has this energy of like, and Rohini specifically, the Rohini part of Taurus is like sowing and planting, growing, charm, beauty, and charisma. So it's like this grounded, earthy beauty charm. Yeah. And new moons are all about like starting a new cycle with our minds. So moving forward from tomorrow in the next moon cycle, getting more grounded in how we, again, love people, really. And so again, this really would line up nicely with the idea of creating a spiritual practice to connect with others and support others. And then the moon is going to be full on June 14th. It's going to be in Jyesta or Scorpio. Jyesta is another nakshatra, lunar mansion. And Jyesta happens to be the USA rising nakshatra. So, again, more correlation here. Jyesta is symbolized by a protective talisman. So the energy of Jyesta is like understanding hidden forces, protecting from danger, imaginative design, daring and praiseworthy deeds. The elders, the founder, people who protect or are protected, like police, UN personnel, and refugees. So again, a lot of these groups and a lot of these energies were involved in the event that happened on May 24th. And so I can see a progression here, like from the May 30th new moon, of how do we get more grounded and more sort of clear, like how do you actually show somebody love, and then we're going to dig deep into like what are the obstacles to that, like really the question is why are our children, not just this particular individual, but why are our children so sad? Yeah, I mean, this kid, he's the one who's getting all the attention right now, but there are plenty of kids, especially with the last 2 years of the pandemic, who are, haven't seen their friends very much, and they haven't seen their teachers, and they're at home, and they're on the computer. If that, I mean, I've been hearing from teachers that, the absences are astronomical even now that they're back in a classroom. The kids just don't even have the expectation to show up anymore. So it's been tough for kids. So this full moon, there's going to be, I think, some digging deep into what's really going on here, and there might be some insight that comes forth from that. And then on June 28th, again, there's going to be another new moon. This is going to be in Ardra in Gemini, And again, I mentioned that the USA, Jupiter is located here. Ardra, the symbol again is a teardrop of rain. And Ardra, this lunar mansion, can symbolize things like medicine, psychology, sadness, destruction and renewal, and loss that leads to new growth and insight. So, again, themes that I've been mentioning about this whole planetary war situation. And so I can imagine that based on the cycle of this next cycle of the moon, I could see that around the time of June 28th, it might take a few days to actually be announced, and that relates to Mercury, which I'm going to get into next. But I could see where there's this new government mental health initiative that's basically meant to address this issue of like, why are children so sad, and how do we address it in a more realistic way, rather than just rhetoric, rather than just fiery speech and posting on the internet or social media. What are we actually going to do about it? I could see there being some new government mental health initiative being announced, towards the end of the month or beginning of next month. And then as far as the sun is going to enter Gemini, Mithuna on June 15th, so the middle of the month there. So Gemini, which represents community, places, ideas, travel, thoughts, because it's an air sign, the sun's going to go there, and so the sun is going to bring energy and sort of drive in that direction. So that's moon and sun, 3rd June. And then we have Saturn and Mercury. So Saturn, I mentioned, is going to go retrograde. That's going to be in a few days on June 3rd. So it's going to backtrack into Capricorn. It's in Aquarius now. Saturn happens to be the owner of both those signs. In Vedic Astrology, this is called Swa, or being in its own sign. So that means Saturn's going to be strong. It is strong now. It's going to stay strong. And it's going to stay in these two signs for the next 3 years. As it backtracks into Capricorn, though, it's moving from Aquarius, an air sign, or thoughts and ideas, into Capricorn, so an earth sign. So it's a more pragmatic energy. And so we might be seeing like a revision of infrastructure versus ideals. Yeah. Mercury is going direct on the same day Saturn's going retrograde. And Mercury pretty soon is heading towards Gemini, where it will be in its own sign. It will also be Swa. And so it's also going to gain strength here. So because it's in Taurus now, again, that practical, earthy energy, and it's going to move into Gemini, so more of an air sign, thoughts and ideas. I could see the Mercury's going to bring in this energy of using the practical experience that we've gained through this to rethink love, or how we demonstrate care to others, and we're going to communicate, and how we can communicate those ideas and have insights about that. And again, the communication is going to happen in public spaces. So I think this is going to line up with this idea that there may be this new government initiative regarding juvenile mental health coming to fruition. So that's Saturn and Mercury. And then finally we have Venus and Mars. So Venus is entering Taurus on June 17th. It's also going to be its own sign, so Swa. It's going to get stronger. And again, Taurus is about grounded, practical, nurturing love and cultivating things, like agriculture and things that need daily, consistent care in a very, material way. Mars is going to enter Aries, its own sign, on June 26th. So again, another Swa planet. It's going to get stronger. And Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, the natural zodiac. So Aries is very much about starting something new. So with Mars entering its own sign and getting stronger, it seems like it's going to be time to begin again with something. And if you've been keeping track here, a lot of these planets are going Swa very soon. They're actually on July 2nd, so save this maybe for the next talk next month. But we're going to have 6 planets in their own house coming up. And so That's great in some ways because the planets are going to be strong, but that also means that there's going to be a lot of exaggerated energy. Again, talk for another day, but that's Venus and Mars. So there you have it. Again, a lot going on, but hopefully this is giving you some astrological understanding or insight into some of the current events that are happening right now. And, you know, my hope always when I share this sort of information is that it gives people like a deeper insight into what's going on so that they can process things, heal, and move forward in life in the best direction possible. So I hope that's true for you. So I thank you for your time, and until the next one, take care.